Gaius Julius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, more infamously known as Caligula, ascended to the Roman throne in 37 AD at the age of just 25. His rise to power came amid a tumultuous political landscape, one shaped by the legacies of Augustus and Tiberius, and a society steeped in wealth, decadence, and unrelenting ambition. From the very beginning, Caligula's rule was marked not merely by his political decisions, but by the extreme behaviors and impulses that would later define his reign. While he initially inspired hope among the Roman populace due to his charismatic nature and popularity as the son of the beloved Germanicus, the emperor's darker tendencies quickly emerged, revealing a man whose desires often surpassed moral and societal constraints. Caligula's early life was rife with trauma and instability. Born in 12 AD, he was the third son of Germanicus, a celebrated general, and Agrippina the Elder, a woman known for her intelligence and political acumen. The young Gaius was exposed from an early age to the treacherous dynamics of Roman imperial politics. The death of his father under suspicious circumstances, widely believed to have been orchestrated by political rivals or even by Tiberius himself, left a lasting mark on Caligula. This early exposure to betrayal and the harsh realities of power may have fueled both his ambition and his emerging cruelty. As he grew, so did his awareness of the fragility of life and the absolute power wielded by the emperor, instilling in him a desire not only to survive, but to dominate without restraint. Before ascending to the throne, Caligula spent years observing the Roman court under the reign of Emperor Tiberius. His time on the island of Capri, where Tiberius had retreated in paranoia and indulgence, was formative. Here, Caligula witnessed firsthand the unchecked excesses and cruelties of an emperor free from the scrutiny of the Roman Senate. It was an education in absolute power, demonstrating both the possibilities and dangers of living without moral or social constraints. Some historical sources suggest that this period of exposure to indulgence and debauchery may have desensitized him to acts that others would consider reprehensible, reinforcing the idea that, once he ascended, no indulgence would be off limits. When Caligula became emperor following Tiberius's death, the Roman people initially rejoiced. His public image was that of a benevolent and approachable ruler, someone who could restore stability and prosperity to the empire. Early in his reign, he enacted policies to reduce taxes, provide lavish games, and engage directly with the populace, a marked contrast to the reclusive Tiberius. Yet, this public persona soon began to mask a more sinister personality. Historical accounts, especially from Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio, suggest that Caligula's initial benevolence quickly devolved into acts of extreme cruelty, sexual debauchery, and psychological manipulation. The emperor's rise to power coincided with the early signs of what would become infamous behavior, an overwhelming need for total control over every aspect of Roman life. His intimate desires were not merely private indulgences, but acts intertwined with dominance and fear. Stories of Caligula's obsession with pleasure, particularly sexual pleasure, were not limited to the secluded spaces of the imperial palace. They often spilled into the public sphere, shocking senators, nobles, and ordinary citizens alike. This behavior was a direct reflection of a man whose absolute power allowed him to pursue desires without any form of accountability, illustrating the corrupting influence of unchecked authority. Caligula's personality combined elements of charm, cruelty, and unpredictability, making him both feared and revered. He understood the power of spectacle and used it to manipulate those around him. A striking example of this manipulation was his early efforts to present himself as a divine figure, blurring the lines between political authority and religious veneration. He demanded recognition not merely as emperor, but as a living god, a move that allowed him to exploit not only political loyalty, but also personal relationships for his gratification. This intertwining of worship and personal indulgence created an environment where intimate acts could serve as tools of both domination and humiliation. Importantly, Caligula's sexual desires were rarely confined to private spaces or consensual relationships. His early reign reveals patterns of using intimacy as a weapon, reflecting a deeper psychological complexity. Historical sources report instances where he humiliated individuals in both public and private, leveraging sexual encounters to assert dominance or punish perceived slights. The very mechanisms of the Roman court, the dependence of nobles and senators on imperial favor, provided fertile ground for such abuses. In this sense, his rise to power was not only political, but also intimately personal, entwining the exercise of sexual desire with the exercise of political control. The emperor's fascination with excess extended beyond sex, into lavish indulgences that demonstrated his insatiable appetite for power and pleasure. Banquets, games, and spectacles were often designed to both awe and terrify, reflecting his belief that those who witnessed his power firsthand would become complicit in his dominance. This environment of fear, admiration, and intrigue allowed Caligula's darker impulses to flourish, ultimately setting the stage for the notorious acts that historians would later recount with horror. His early life experiences, exposure to imperial excess, and psychological conditioning created a volatile mix of charm, cunning, and cruelty, a perfect storm for the intimate horrors that would define his reign. Caligula's rise to power, therefore, cannot be understood merely as a political succession. It was the culmination of a life shaped by trauma, observation, and ambition. The young emperor's unchecked desires were a product of personal experience and the intoxicating freedom of absolute authority. From the very start, his reign blurred the lines between public duty and private indulgence, setting a precedent for the intimate excesses that would become his hallmark. The early promise that Caligula might restore Roman glory quickly gave way to a pattern of behaviors that shocked contemporaries and left a lasting mark on history. The emperor's initial popularity became irrelevant as fear, obsession, and desire dictated the course of his rule. In conclusion, Caligula, as ascent to power, illustrates the dangerous combination of youthful ambition, exposure to absolute authority, and personal trauma. His rise was marked by a transition from a charismatic and seemingly benevolent leader to a ruler whose intimate desires were inseparable from his pursuit of power. The early stage of his reign, full of charm and promise, masked the psychological patterns that would later manifest in acts of extreme cruelty. Why? Sexual deviance and moral transgression. By understanding this period of Caligula's life, one gains insight not only into the development of his intimate horrors, but also into the broader dynamics of power, excess, and human vulnerability that have fascinated historians for centuries. Once Caligula ascended to the throne, the imperial palace quickly transformed from a symbol of Roman power into a theater of excess, indulgence, and unrestrained debauchery. While his early reign had inspired hope with promises of reform and generosity, it soon became evident that the young emperor's personal pleasures were paramount, often eclipsing any sense of duty or morality. The palace, designed to impress with grandeur and architectural sophistication, became a stage for Caligula's private indulgences, where boundaries were routinely obliterated, and every desire could be pursued without consequence. Caligula's appetite for luxury and hedonism was legendary. Historical sources describe banquets so lavish that they were almost theatrical performances, blurring the line between feasting and spectacle. These gatherings were not merely about nourishment or entertainment, they were displays of power, designed to impress, intimidate, and manipulate. The emperor's table featured exotic delicacies from across the Roman Empire, peacocks, wild boar, flamingo tongues, and imported wines that symbolized both his wealth and his capacity to command the resources of an empire. Yet the indulgence extended far beyond culinary excess. Banquets often became settings for acts of humiliation and sexual debauchery, where Caligula would force nobles, senators, or even visiting dignitaries into morally compromising situations, asserting dominance under the guise of entertainment. The emperor's obsession with pleasure often took on bizarre and grotesque forms. Caligula was known to invite guests to his private chambers for games that blurred the lines between amusement and cruelty. Ancient sources, particularly Suetonius, describe instances of sexual acts performed in public or semi-public settings, suggesting that the emperor derived satisfaction not only from the act itself, but from the power dynamics inherent in forcing others to participate or witness his desires. The imperial palace, a space theoretically reserved for governance and strategy, became instead a playground for caprice, where protocol and decency were secondary to the emperor's whims. One particularly infamous aspect of Caligula's debauchery was his treatment of women within the palace. He is said to have seduced, coerced, or humiliated women of noble birth, using sexual favors as both reward and punishment. The emperor's manipulation of intimacy extended to members of his own family, with rumors of incestuous behavior directed toward his sisters. Whether fully accurate or exaggerated by later historians, these accounts illustrate a key characteristic of his reign: the use of sexual activity as a tool of power. In this environment, no one, neither high-ranking officials nor members of the imperial household, was truly safe from his advances or his schemes. The palace itself became an instrument in his pursuit of domination, a private world where morality was dictated by the emperor alone. Caligula's debauchery was not confined to sexual exploits. He was notorious for his extravagant spending, commissioning statues, palaces, and other opulent projects designed to demonstrate his supremacy. One striking example was his construction of a temporary floating bridge across the Bay of Baiae, a project considered both absurd and extravagant, undertaken merely to prove his power over nature and ridicule those who questioned him. Similarly, he is said to have adorned the palace with garish displays of wealth and luxury, sometimes using materials inappropriately or grotesquely. Gold, marble, and precious stones were lavishly consumed in ways that emphasized his ego and the performative nature of his excess. The palace, in essence, became both a sanctuary and a stage for his caprice, where each indulgence reflected his broader desire to astonish, dominate, and shock. Within this environment, servants, slaves, and courtiers were forced to navigate a treacherous social landscape. The emperor's intimate desires were unpredictable and often punitive. Refusal, hesitation, or even perceived disrespect could result in punishment, public humiliation, or exile. Suetonius recounts how Caligula would sometimes invite individuals to participate in sexual acts under duress, only to later publicly mock them. This blending of sexual indulgence and intimidation reinforced the emperor's absolute authority, creating a culture in which fear, pleasure, and power were inextricably linked. The palace thus became a microcosm of his broader rule, an empire governed as much by terror and spectacle as by law or order. Another dimension of Caligula's palace debauchery was his fascination with public humiliation as entertainment. He is said to have enjoyed forcing guests into degrading acts or staging mock trials to ridicule them, combining cruelty with sexual impropriety. This was a hallmark of his reign. Pleasure was rarely private or consensual. It was performative, often cruel, and designed to assert his dominance over those around him. The palace became a theater of psychological manipulation, where intimacy, indulgence, and fear were deliberately intertwined. Caligula's obsession with control extended to all aspects of palace life, including the organization of his personal chambers and the conduct of his attendants. Some historical accounts suggest that he would maintain precise knowledge of everyone's private actions, using this information to manipulate or blackmail. In this sense, the palace was not only a site of indulgence, but also a tool for surveillance and power, where every act, public or private, could serve the emperor's agenda. By merging personal pleasure with political strategy, Caligula transformed the concept of the imperial palace into something far darker than a mere residence. It became an instrument of domination and a reflection of his psychological pathology. It is also crucial to recognize that much of Caligula's debauchery was amplified by fear and rumor. Contemporary historians often relied on anecdotal or second-hand accounts, which sometimes exaggerated the grotesque or scandalous aspects of his behavior. Yet even accounting for potential exaggeration, the consistency of reports concerning his obsession with pleasure, cruelty, and domination suggests a pattern of behavior that was both extreme and systematic. The palace, in all its luxury and confinement, became the central stage for these actions, illustrating the dangerous intersection of absolute power, unchecked desire, and psychological instability. Ultimately, the debauchery of the imperial palace was emblematic of the broader trajectory of Caligula's reign. It reflected not only his personal appetites, but also the ways in which power, unchecked by law or tradition, can warp human behavior. Within these walls, pleasure was weaponized, morality was negotiable, and fear was a constant companion. The emperor's excesses, sexual, financial, and psychological, shocked contemporaries and left a legacy of horror that would define his place in history. The palace was no longer merely a seat of governance, it was a theater of perversion, a manifestation of Caligula's dominance, and a harbinger of the intimate horrors that would later cement his reputation as one of history's most infamous rulers. In conclus, Ion, the debauchery in the imperial palace was not simply a matter of indulgence, it was a reflection of Caligula's character, his psychological impulses, and the terrifying potential of absolute power. His acts, extravagant, cruel, and often sexual, blurred the boundaries between private desire and public spectacle. By examining the palace as both a literal and symbolic space, we see how Caligula's pleasures became instruments of control, creating an environment where fear and indulgence were inseparable. The excesses of the imperial palace thus illuminate the broader pattern of his reign, a disturbing blend of desire, domination, and debauchery that continues to captivate and horrify historians and readers. Caligula's reign is remembered not only for his excesses but also for the chilling way he intertwined sexual desire with acts of cruelty. For the Roman emperor, intimacy was never just about pleasure. It was a mechanism of power, humiliation, and psychological domination. His sexual behavior was inseparable from his cruelty, often leaving victims bewildered, terrified, or publicly shamed. The line between passion and violence was blurred, making his private indulgences some of the most horrifying aspects of his rule. One of the defining traits of Caligula's intimate cruelty was his use of sexual acts as tools of intimidation. Unlike a ruler who pursued private pleasure discreetly, Caligula often orchestrated situations where the act itself became a form of punishment or assertion of power. Ancient historians such as Suetonius describe numerous instances in which women, whether noble women, court attendants, or even his own relatives, were coerced into sexual encounters under threat of public disgrace or worse. These acts were rarely motivated by mutual desire. They were instruments for demonstrating that no one, regardless of status, could escape his will. In this sense, cruelty was not a byproduct of his passion, it was its foundation. Caligula's cruelty also extended to men. Accounts suggest that he manipulated and humiliated male courtiers by forcing them into morally compromising situations or making them participate in sexual spectacles for his amusement. He reportedly derived pleasure from their discomfort and fear, turning intimacy into a tool for psychological torment. By publicly asserting dominance in such private and intimate spheres, Caligula blurred the distinction between desire and tyranny. Sexual encounters were not just about indulgence, they became performative acts that reinforced the hierarchy he imposed with absolute authority. The emperor's cruelty was often amplified by his unpredictability. One moment he might appear charming, even generous. The next, he could unleash intense cruelty on those who had wronged him, or even on those who simply displeased him. This volatility made every intimate encounter a potential trap. Guests and servants never knew if a private meeting with the emperor would result in pleasure, punishment, or public humiliation. Tacitus and Cassius Dio recount instances in which individuals were coerced into sexual acts, only to be publicly shamed afterward. The ambiguity between passion and cruelty was part of the terror. No one could ever be sure whether the emperor's attention was a reward or a sentence. A particularly horrifying dimension of Caligula's intimate cruelty was his manipulation of family members. Ancient sources hint at rumors of sexual advances toward his sisters, though details are often obscured by the sensationalism of later accounts. Even if these reports were exaggerated, they illustrate how he violated social and moral norms with impunity. The very idea that an emperor could use intimacy as a means of asserting dominance over his closest relatives highlights the depth of his psychological pathology. In Caligula's world, sexual relationships were not bound by affection, loyalty, or morality. They were simply extensions of his absolute power. Caligula's cruelty was not limited to physical acts. It also included elaborate schemes designed to psychologically torment his victims. Historical accounts describe him setting up situations where individuals were forced to watch the degradation of others or were compelled to participate in acts that violated their morals. By creating an environment where fear, shame, and desire were intertwined, he exercised control in a uniquely insidious way. Intimacy became a stage upon which Caligula could demonstrate his omnipotence, ensuring that his influence extended beyond the palace walls and into the minds of those he ruled. The emperor's cruelty often manifested during the famed banquets and gatherings in the imperial palace. While these events were outwardly social and festive, they often doubled as stages for manipulation, humiliation, and sexual exploitation. Guests might be pressured into sexual acts or forced to witness intimate encounters orchestrated by the emperor. These spectacles served multiple purposes. They entertained Caligula, reinforced his dominance, and instilled fear among those present. The combination of spectacle and cruelty exemplifies how he merged personal desire with political control, making sexual acts instruments of both pleasure and terror. Another layer of cruelty in Caligula's intimate exploits was his use of wealth and status as leverage. Those who were vulnerable to imperial favor, nobles, courtiers, or foreign dignitaries, could be coerced into sexual acts under threat of punishment, exile, or loss of property. The emperor weaponized his position, ensuring that refusal or resistance was not an option. In this way, intimate cruelty became a strategic tool, enforcing his dominance over both individuals and the broader political landscape. It was a brutal demonstration of how desire, power, and terror could intersect under an absolute ruler. Caligula's blending of cruelty and passion also extended to public spectacles designed to humiliate and degrade. Some historians report that he forced individuals into sexual acts during games or ceremonies, creating situations in which victims could not escape the public eye. The combination of exposure, shame, and physical coercion magnified the horror of these acts. In essence, Caligula transformed intimacy into a performative cruelty, where every act served both his pleasure and his need to dominate psychologically. These public humiliations also reinforced his reputation as a ruler unbound by conventional morality, instilling fear and awe in the population. Importantly, the cruelty disguised as passion was not merely arbitrary, it followed a pattern of psychological manipulation. By controlling sexual encounters and orchestrating humiliation, Caligula ensured that his subjects remained dependent, fearful, and subservient. This extended to the inner workings of the palace, where slaves, attendants, and officials lived in constant anticipation of the emperor's whims. The fear of being drawn into his intimate cruelty created a pervasive tension, reinforcing his authority through terror and uncertainty. Caligula's ability to merge desire with psychological control was a hallmark of his rule, demonstrating the uniquely destructive potential of absolute power. Finally, the legacy of Caligula's intimate cruelty is inseparable from his broader infamy. Historians have long debated the accuracy of these accounts, considering that many were written by political opponents or later chroniclers eager to sensationalize his reign. However, the consistency of reports depicting the blending of sexual desire and cruelty suggests a pattern that was deeply ingrained in his character. Caligula's actions illuminate the extreme consequences of power unchecked by law, ethics, or social constraints. His intimate cruelty serves as a chilling reminder that absolute authority can warp personal desire into instruments of terror, leaving victims psychologically scarred and history forever haunted by the legacy of fear. In conclusion, Caligula's cruelty disguised as passion exemplifies the terrifying intersection of desire, power, and psychological manipulation. Sexual acts under his rule were rarely private or consensual. They were strategic, performative, and designed to dominate. By blending pleasure with fear, he transformed intimacy into a weapon, ensuring that every interaction reinforced his authority. Within the imperial palace, cruelty and passion were inseparable, creating an environment of terror that extended from the personal to the political. The horrors of these acts illustrate the uniquely destructive potential of absolute power, marking Caligula as one of history's most infamous rulers. Caligula's reign was infamous not only for acts of debauchery and cruelty, but also for his tangled web of illicit affairs, many of which violated social, moral, and familial boundaries. While sexual misconduct was not uncommon among Roman elites, the emperor's relationships were marked by audacity, manipulation, and a flagrant disregard for convention. Among the most notorious allegations were those of incestuous relationships with his sisters, which became symbolic of the emperor's moral corruption and disregard for the sacred laws of Rome. These scandals, whether exaggerated by historians or grounded in reality, reveal a ruler for whom sexual conquest was as much a demonstration of power as it was a personal indulgence. From the outset of his reign, Caligula displayed an obsessive interest in sexual intimacy that extended beyond the ordinary bounds of Roman aristocracy. Historical accounts suggest that he pursued relationships with a wide range of women, including court ladies, noblewomen, and even married women of prominence. In many cases, these affairs were not driven by genuine affection, but by a desire to assert dominance, humiliate the target, or display his control over others. The sexual exploits of Caligula were therefore inherently political, blurring the line between personal pleasure and public spectacle. By making intimacy a tool of both indulgence and power, the emperor ensured that even sexual relationships reinforced his absolute authority. The most scandalous of Caligula's alleged relationships were those with his sisters, particularly Drusilla, Julia Livilla, and Agrippina the Younger. Ancient historians like Suetonius and Cassius Dio suggest that Caligula may have engaged in sexual relations with one or more of them, acts considered deeply taboo even by the permissive standards of Roman aristocracy. These allegations were widely publicized by contemporary and later writers who portrayed them as emblematic of the emperor's moral decay. While some modern scholars debate the historical accuracy of these accounts, the very existence of such claims underscores the perception that Caligula flouted social norms to an extraordinary degree. Whether fact or rumor, these stories contributed to the emperor's reputation as a ruler consumed by lust, power, and a willingness to violate even the most sacred familial bonds. Caligula's affairs were often interwoven with elements of manipulation and coercion. For example, noblewomen or court attendants might be compelled to participate in sexual relationships under threat of political or personal retribution. Marriages and betrothals were sometimes disregarded or overturned at the emperor's whim, demonstrating his belief that his desires superseded both law and tradition. By controlling the intimate lives of those around him, Caligula reinforced a culture of fear and dependence within the palace. These acts highlight how sexual relationships were not private matters, but instruments of psychological domination, further amplifying his infamous reputation. Public perception of these scandals played a critical role in solidifying Caligula's image as an immoral and dangerous ruler. The Roman populace, while often fascinated by tales of imperial excess, reacted with a mixture of fear, disgust, and awe. Stories of incestuous or coercive affairs were particularly potent as they transgressed deeply ingrained moral and religious norms. Such reports ensured that Caligula's personal indulgences became a matter of public concern, reinforcing his image as a ruler whose power was inseparable from moral corruption. In effect, the emperor's affairs served as both private pleasure and public propaganda, underscoring the extreme reach of his authority. Beyond familial and coerced relationships, Caligula's sexual exploits reportedly extended to more sensational forms of indulgence. Accounts suggest he engaged in affairs with married women in high society, seducing them as a means of humiliating their husbands and demonstrating his dominance. By turning intimacy into a mechanism for social and political manipulation, Caligula elevated sexual scandal into an art form of power. These relationships were often performed under the scrutiny of the palace or other courtiers, further emphasizing that his pursuit of pleasure was inseparable from spectacle, control, and fear. Some sources suggest that Caligula even pushed the boundaries of public morality in ways that challenged the very fabric of Roman society. For instance, he is reported to have engaged in sexual liaisons openly, inviting observation from others in the palace or during social gatherings. This performative aspect of his behavior reinforced the terrifying notion that no one, neither noble nor commoner, was beyond the reach of his desires. By transforming private acts of intimacy into public spectacles, Caligula combined lust, humiliation, and authority, creating an environment in which scandal and fear coexisted. The emperor's obsession with power through sexual dominance also extended to women who were entirely outside the imperial family. Courtesans, slaves, and visiting dignitaries could be drawn into his web of affairs, often without consent. The common thread in all these relationships was the assertion of control. By engaging in sexual acts, Caligula demonstrated that his authority extended into the most private and intimate aspects of life. Sexual conquest was not merely indulgence, it was a vivid display of dominance that left witnesses, participants, and victims alike aware of the emperor's unchallengeable power. It is also important to consider the psychological dimension of these affairs. Caligula's relationships appear to have been driven by more than physical desire. They were deeply entwined with his need for validation, control, and spectacle. By orchestrating sexual scandals, he could manipulate emotions, intimidate adversaries, and assert supremacy. In many ways, his affairs were a form of political theater, where the interplay of fear, lust, and obsession underscored the absolute power of the emperor. The combination of psychological manipulation and sexual exploitation made these scandals particularly disturbing, demonstrating the depth of his depravity. The long-term impact of Caligula's affairs and incestuous scandals extended beyond the palace. They contributed to a climate of fear, gossip, and political instability as families and individuals were forced to navigate the treacherous waters of imperial favor. Senators, noble families, and foreign dignitaries all had to consider the possibility that the emperor's whims could disrupt their personal lives or compromise their honor. In this sense, Caligula's sexual scandals were not isolated episodes of immorality, but strategic exercises in control, ensuring that those around him remained subordinate and fearful. In conclusion, Caligula's affairs and alleged incestuous relationships represent one of the most disturbing dimensions of his reign. They highlight a ruler for whom intimacy was inseparable from power, coercion, and spectacle. By pursuing relationships that violated moral, familial, and social boundaries, he transformed private desire into a weapon of psychological domination. Whether these scandals are entirely factual or partly exaggerated, they illuminate the extraordinary lengths to which Caligula went to assert his supremacy and indulge his appetites. His personal relationships were never merely about pleasure. They were extensions of tyranny, creating an environment in which fear, lust, and scandal became inseparable. In the annals of history, these affairs remain emblematic of a ruler whose moral corruption was as absolute as his political authority, leaving a legacy of horror that continues to captivate and horrify scholars and readers. Caligula's reign, though brief, left an indelible mark on the Roman Empire and on history itself, remembered as a period of unbridled excess, cruelty, and moral corruption. While his actions during life were shocking enough, the enduring fascination with his legacy stems not only from his acts of debauchery, but also from the psychological, political, and societal impact they had on his contemporaries and on subsequent generations. From the palace intrigues to the broader perception of imperial authority, Caligula's intimate horrors and public spectacles created a lasting image of a ruler whose power was inseparable from fear, obsession, and scandal. The immediate reaction to Caligula's reign was one of terror and disbelief. Romans, nobles, senators, and common citizens alike were forced to navigate the unpredictable whims of an emperor whose actions often defied all expectation or reason. Tales of sexual debauchery, incestuous relationships, and public humiliation circulated widely, reinforcing the perception that the emperor's desire for dominance knew no boundaries. For many contemporaries, the palace became not only a center of governance, but a site of fear, where intimate cruelty was wielded as an instrument of power. The psychological impact on those who lived under his rule cannot be overstated. Trust, privacy, and social norms were continuously undermined by the emperor's unpredictable indulgences. Caligula's notoriety was further cemented by the accounts of Roman historians such as Suetonius, Cassius Dio, and Tacitus, who chronicled his excesses in vivid and often lurid detail. These chroniclers emphasized the shocking nature of his intimate acts, from coercive sexual relationships to public spectacles of humiliation, ensuring that Caligula's deeds would become the stuff of legend. While some historians have debated the accuracy of these reports, acknowledging that political opponents and later writers may have exaggerated the grotesque, they nevertheless contribute to a consistent image of a ruler whose private pleasures were inseparable from public terror. The historical record, therefore, not only documents Caligula's actions, but also reflects the broader societal horror they inspired. A crucial element of Caligula's legacy is the way he altered the perception of imperial power itself, by transforming intimacy, pleasure, and cruelty into instruments of authority. He demonstrated that the emperor's reach extended into every sphere of Roman life. Sexual acts, public spectacles, and the humiliation of both courtiers and family members were all manifestations of his absolute control. In doing so, he redefined the potential and the danger of unchecked power. Subsequent emperors and citizens alike were left to grapple with the psychological precedent set by Caligula, that an emperor's whims could dominate private lives, corrupt social norms, and even destabilize political structures. The enduring fascination with Caligula is also tied to the moral horror he evoked. His intimate scandals, particularly the alleged incestuous relationships with his sisters, challenged deeply held Roman values regarding family, honor, and decency. By violating these norms, whether through fact or rumor, Caligula became a symbol of moral corruption and the dangers of absolute power unrestrained by law or ethics. Even centuries later, his name became synonymous with depravity, excess, and the terrifying potential for a single individual to manipulate both desire and fear. His reign serves as a cautionary tale about the human capacity for cruelty when authority is concentrated without accountability. Beyond moral and psychological impact, Caligula's actions had tangible political consequences. His manipulation of intimacy and public spectacles often destabilized traditional structures of authority. Senators, nobles, and other influential figures were coerced into submission or humiliation, undermining established hierarchies and creating an atmosphere of uncertainty. Even his lavish spending on games, banquets, and architectural extravagances strained the empire's resources, demonstrating the intersection of personal indulgence with political mismanagement. Caligula's rule illustrates how unchecked desire and cruelty can ripple outward, affecting not just private lives but entire systems of governance. The emperor's legacy was further amplified by his assassination in 41 AD, only 4 years into his reign. His death at the hands of palace guards and conspirators was both a direct response to his tyranny and a stark reflection of the fear and resentment he had engendered. The manner of his assassination, violent, sudden, and conspiratorial, underscores how deeply his cruelty and excess had alienated those closest to him. In the aftermath, stories of his intimate horrors and public scandals were eagerly recounted, cementing his infamy for future generations. The posthumous reputation of Caligula thus became a blend of historical fact, rumor, and moralistic storytelling, creating an enduring image of terror and depravity. Culturally, Caligula's legacy has transcended history, influencing literature, art, and popular imagination for centuries. His life and actions have inspired plays, novels, and films that emphasize his excess, cruelty, and scandalous behavior. He has become a symbol of the corrupting influence of power, the dangers of unchecked desire, and the terrifying consequences of human immorality. Even today, references to Caligula-like behavior evoke images of extreme indulgence, sadistic manipulation, and sexual depravity. This enduring cultural presence demonstrates how deeply his personal and political excesses resonated across time and society. It is also important to consider the lessons Caligula's reign provides regarding the human psyche and the effects of absolute power. His early experiences, loss, trauma, exposure to court intrigue, combined with unrestricted authority, created a man whose desires and cruelties became inseparable from governance. The palace became a microcosm for the extreme consequences of power, concentrated in a single individual, showing how personal pathology can manifest on a societal scale. In this sense, Caligula's legacy is not only a story of scandal, but also a study in psychology, power dynamics, and the potential dangers inherent in absolute authority. Ultimately, the horror of Caligula's reign lies not just in the acts themselves, but in the way they continue to captivate and terrify modern audiences. Stories of sexual exploitation, cruelty disguised as passion, and scandalous affairs with family members serve as a reminder of the destructive potential of power without accountability. His reign illustrates that when desire, cruelty, and authority intersect, the results can be catastrophic, both for individuals and for society as a whole. Caligula's personal and political excesses, preserved through historical accounts and cultural retellings, ensure that his infamy endures, making him one of history's most notorious rulers. In conclusion, Caligula's legacy of infamy and public horror is a multifaceted phenomenon. It encompasses moral corruption, psychological terror, political destabilization, and cultural influence. Through his intimate acts, public spectacles, and scandalous relationships, he demonstrated the extreme consequences of unrestrained power and des. The palace, the court, and the empire itself became stages for his cruelty and indulgence, leaving contemporaries in fear and historians in awe. Even centuries later, the emperor's name evokes horror, fascination, and moral reflection, highlighting the enduring impact of a ruler whose life and actions continue to serve as a chilling lesson in the dark potential of human ambition and unchecked authority.